Are hypersonic weapons game changers? That's certainly the image that is being presented. From painting scary scenarios of hypersonics coming in under the radar to strike the targets with pinpoint accuracy and overwhelming a country's defenses and political institutions in mere seconds, hypersonics have seen a lot of media, with especially Russia and China pushing a narrative that hypersonics provide them with a new miracle weapon. The question is any of this true? In this brief, I will make a full assessment of hypersonics to answer that question. As always, I will have easy chapter markings to follow if you want to skip a certain section, although I highly recommend sticking around for the full video, as every chapter builds upon the earlier ones. This is especially so because of the media, where hypersonic weapons are often misunderstood, leading to some very poor takes, so going through the whole thing in one go is certainly best. And of course, as in all my videos, you can find all sources in the description along with some helpful links. Hypersonic weapons are weapons that travel at hypersonic speed. So far so good, Captain Obvious, you might say. But really, just a speed-based definition, that's not really the best way to go about this, because it's just part of what hypersonic weapons are. As a rule, hypersonic is any speed from Mach 5 upwards, so 5 times the speed of sound. But a definition only based on Mach 5 is a poor one, and this is for two reasons. First, the impact of altitude, or rather of air density, on speeds. To be at Mach 5, the weapon must move at a variety of speeds depending on its altitude. This variation is wide. Between sea level and 11 kilometers of altitude alone, it is anywhere from approximately 6,100 kph to 5,300 kph. In short, Mach 5 can mean very different things. Second, many missiles, including older systems that date back as far as World War II, at one point or throughout most of their flight envelope, will reach Mach 5. An intercontinental ballistic missile, for example, comfortably exceeds Mach 5 during ascent and re-entry. So why is a hypersonic missile going at hypersonic speed different to these other missiles going at hypersonic speeds? Well, there are a variety of definitions that give us really the distinction, and all to some degree really incorporate the capabilities of a hypersonic missile or glide vehicle to make them distinct from other missiles that can also go at hypersonic speeds. The golden ticket here is to understand the difference in terms of the capability to extensively maneuver during the entire flight of the hypersonic missile or hypersonic missile or glide vehicle, as opposed to, for example, the ICBM that makes dedicated pre-programmed adjustments based on the input trajectory. The ability to hold its speed and maneuver is due to control and guidance avionics, as well as longer-lasting scramjet propulsion in hypersonic cruise missiles, which are of course optimized for the speeds and the altitudes the missile is operating at. Now, there are two main types of hypersonics that we concern ourselves with today, and it's important to keep them apart. There are the hypersonic cruise missiles, and then there's also the hypersonic glide vehicle. They are generally abbreviated HCM and HGV. The difference is that the HCM is equipped with propulsion, usually a scramjet propulsion system, allowing it to maintain speed and altitude throughout the flight. It should be remembered, however, that hypersonic cruise missiles also incorporate a booster that is then decoupled once the weapon reaches the apex of its flight trajectory. A hypersonic glide vehicle, or HGV, is first boosted to a high hypersonic speed through the use of a ballistic rocket. Then it decouples from that rocket and glides towards the target at high speed. What a hypersonic glide vehicle loses in independent propulsion, it gains somewhat in simplicity, as less room is required for the now missing scramjet propulsion and fuel system. However, that is not to say that this is a cheap device or low tech. On the contrary, they are expensive, and like HCMs, they require a lot of systems and components, from thermal shielding to guidance and control, electric power, sensors, inertial navigation, flight stabilization, and of course the payload. But the omission of an engine at least reduces the complexity somewhat in terms of what is actually added to the machine and takes room in the machine. I found that the best way to think about a hypersonic glide vehicle is basically by imagining a space shuttle re-entering the atmosphere for landing, minus of course the speed, because the space shuttle eventually will go a lot slower, and of course the crew and manual control. In a nutshell, it is still very similar. To sum up, there are many weapons that go at hypersonic speeds, but hypersonic missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles operate in a very distinct way that differs from their cousins. So when I talk about hypersonics in this very video, I refer to hypersonic missiles or those glide vehicles that work exactly in the manner that I just described. What hypersonics exist nowadays? Well, basically everyone is developing them. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there are major programs on the way in, of course, the United States, in Europe, in China and Russia, and then, of course, India, Japan, South Korea and Australia are in the mix too, while some countries are in the process of starting their own programs, demonstrators or parts of it. Then, of course, we got countries like North Korea that make claims to it, but, you know, it's North Korea, so who knows what a hypersonic missile is for them. I'll go through some of these systems now, focusing on the US, Russia and China, so the big three here. Before I do that, however, a quick note about nuclear warheads. I think if there is one thing that we can all agree on, it is that nuclear warheads are not our friends, and various hypersonics have been developed with nuclear warheads in mind, like for example the Russian Avangard or the Chinese Intercontinental Hypersonic Glide Vehicle project. However, the main takeaway should be that paper-stated capabilities do not necessarily mean that these warheads have already been fitted. There is a difference between having a device nuclear capable, so having mounted a warhead dummy representing the actual nuclear warhead and having developed that nuclear warhead for that weapon, and actually having test fired it with a real nuclear warhead. It is a technical as much as a legal difference as far as I understand it, but I will leave it to the legal experts to debate the nuances of this. Feel free to leave as long a comment as you would like on that. Now let's go through the main players. Russia has been looking at it since the 1980s, but only accelerated work recently in what it saw as a response to the US leaving the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2001. This focus is largely because the Russian arsenal of conventional ICBMs has been relatively muted by the arsenal that the US can field, and of course the US's defensive countermeasures as well. So hypersonics essentially were seen as a way to level the playing field again. Russia focuses their work on three main systems: the Avangard, the 3M-22 Zirkon, and a repurposed air-launched Kinzhal. The Avangard is a futuristic-looking glide vehicle deployed via the SS-19 ICBM and the new RS-28 Sarmat. On paper, it presents a HGV going upwards of Mach 20 and with constant changes to direction and altitude to make interception difficult, and it is also the one that Russia likes to show off the most, though by now, given the state of the Russian armed forces and its industry, as well as the propensity of Russia to make big claims, the relevance of the Avangard remains somewhat theoretical, even though it was reported to have been successfully tested multiple times. Russia does have testing facilities for this, for example in Zhukovsky, Novosibirsk and at multiple air bases. However, taking it from that prototype stage to full-scale large number production is a challenge. And so far Russia has struggled with that in almost all of their aviation modernization programs. Then Russia has the ship-launched hypersonic cruise missile, the Zirkon. Reportedly these are to be deployed on some cruisers, frigates as well as their Yarsen-class submarines. Then the air-launched Kinzhal is basically a repurposed Iskander. Russia indicates it can fire these by fast movers like the MiG-31 and the Sukhoi 34 and potentially the Tupolev Tu-22M3 strategic bombers. Russia has also claimed that it has already used these weapons in Ukraine. Overall, on paper, this lineup of hypersonics does encompass the whole range from long-range hypersonic glide vehicles over to shorter-range hypersonic cruise missiles. But we are talking about Russia here, and there is good reasons to be somewhat skeptical, without dismissing the threat, mind you, but simply to apply some healthy skepticism about the capabilities of these missiles, and especially Russia's ability to field them in high numbers. If you have seen my recent conversation with Vladimir Dobrev, a Russian-speaking defense analyst who has been looking at the Russian aviation industry for a long time, you already know what I'm alluding to. Moving over to China. Similarly to Russia, China sees hypersonics as potentially a means to even the playing field with the US, at least on the regional level, or to balance out certain elements therein, given that the US's arsenal of ICBMs and defensive missiles against ICBMs is quite good. Reportedly, China is working on two main systems. although only the intercontinental one has seen much attention. This is reportedly shot into space. Well, where space begins is a matter of definition, but it goes essentially outside of the atmosphere with a Long March type rocket, which then deploys the Hypersonic Glide Vehicle where it orbits until descending on the target. This makes the weapon somewhat different from traditional, if we can call them like that, Hypersonic Glide Vehicles, as then this weapon is a space-based global strike asset that can loiter until required or until it is in the desired position. There are also reports that China works on sea, land or air-launched hypersonic cruise missiles in order to provide regional deterrence. China, of course, has demonstrated that it is very interested in strengthening their southern and eastern shoreline defenses along the island chain, with an eye then, of course, also towards Taiwan and US carrier groups. In this light, we have seen the DFZF become operational, and this can be deployed by the Dongfeng 17 and potentially the Dongfeng 21, the 31, and there are also some reports on the 41 as well. Each extends the range and the speed of the ZF. I would expect them to look at this more closely in the future. They are also working on the Xingkong 2 or Starry Sky 2 as a wave-riding HGV. That might indicate as one of the directions, and they have also recently invested a lot in upgrading their testing facilities, including new wind tunnels for hypersonic testing. On the surface level, the United States appears to be somewhat behind the curve on hypersonics, but looks can be very deceiving, especially if all the media really talks about is Russian and Chinese systems. This is obviously not exactly true. The US has been looking at hypersonics in Cold War experiments, but some of those then of course got cancelled, and then there was of course also a lot of work conducted in the early 2010s when the US was testing these hypersonic missiles and glide vehicles already. But overall it does look like in the meantime hypersonics took a little bit of a backseat for a couple of years, or were not pushed with the same urgency that perhaps in other countries it was the case. So even though the United States started out very strong, but it might have lost the ball for a couple of years, at least in the public eye. But if that is the case, the industrial and technological base of the US, plus the money they can throw at it, can certainly make up for it. I will also add that because Western open source materials tend to be a lot more accessible to me, and at the same time they are usually more transparent about challenges and failure, there is more to chew through here if we look at US systems, which can of course then create the image that other countries are doing it better because they're only showing off their successes, or we only hear of their successes, when in actual fact it is simply because the data we have is more limited and the stuff that we have on the US is simply more transparent. Unlike Russia and China, who anticipate to develop dual-use capabilities with conventional and nuclear warheads, the US currently focuses on systems using only conventional warheads. For this, the US has multiple programs centered around the Navy, Army and Air Force, as well as DARPA, so the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. For the Navy, we have a glide vehicle as part of the Conventional Prompt Strike, CPS, and the Offensive Air Surface Warfare Increment 2, with an abbreviation that I'm not even going to bother pronouncing. OAZU. Yeah, you know, it's written right there. This is also known as the Hypersonic Air-Launched something, and that is abbreviated to HALO, which is a lot more wieldable. Right now, CPS is meant to slowly roll out for testing on destroyers and submarines, while HALO is aimed initially at the FA-18 Super Hornet. The Army's long-range hypersonic weapon is worked on in cooperation with the Navy's CPS. It is meant to provide a strategic attack capability against high-value or rear targets. And then, of course, we come to the Air Force, and they have the AGM-183 Air-Launched Rapid Response Weapon, or ARRW, which so far has seen a couple of setbacks, as far as I can understand it. The Air Force has also canned the Hypersonic Conventional Strike Weapon in favor of the ARRW, as the latter provided the Air Force with more options in terms of its specifications, and also because of its smaller size. For example, a B-52 is reported to have the potential launching capabilities of up to 4 arrows, whereas with the Hypersonic Conventional Strike Weapon, it was down in the, well, maybe 1 or 2, if I remember correctly. Then we also have the smaller Hypersonic Attack Cruise Missile program that is being worked on. Again, a B-52 is projected to carry a lot of these, up to 20 sometimes is the number that you can find. DARPA then, of course, provides a lot of the main testing, technological and technical support with their own projects. Let's move on then. Now that we know what they are and what they do, why are these missiles such a threat? Let's break open that discussion into individual components. I will talk about three main elements that really increase the capabilities of hypersonics. So that is speed, of course, detection and evasion. For this then, let us have a look at how a hypersonic reaches its target. To visualize this, I start with a picture of the flight path of a traditional intercontinental missile. Since it is on a 2D projection, it is simplified, but as you can see, the ballistic missile follows that famous semi-elliptical path by going as high as possible with its propulsion and then falling back towards the intended victim courtesy of short maneuvering guidance, temporary burn segments, and our old friend gravity. A hypersonic weapon also first climbs to altitude, but generally stays within the atmosphere. It then dives or glides towards the target at low altitude, and this brings me to the first advantage they hold, and that is speed. The first step in the flight trajectory is to get both the speed and the altitude of the hypersonic cruise missile and the glide vehicle up. It does that by essentially going to altitude at a high speed, and altitude of course equals potential energy, which can be transferred back into speed, allowing you to maintain a set speed by drawing on that energy reserve, and of course also extending the reach of the weapon before you run out of steam. This step is especially important for a hypersonic glide vehicle, since next to the speed that it holds at the flight apex when it decouples from that external booster, this altitude is transferred into speed as it dives or glides. This way it can approach the target at the intended low altitude, which is exactly what you want, and that will become important in just a minute. You can now correctly point out that the speed these hypersonics fly at are considerably lower than that of the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. There are two important takeaways to that, which work in favor of the hypersonic, however. The first one is that at ranges of about 600 to 2000 kilometers, depending on the type of hypersonic, so mainly if you're going in at, let's say, at Mach 5 or Mach 8, the time to target is in favor of the hypersonic, because it takes that more direct path to the target. Only beyond that range does the ICBM actually hit the target before the hypersonic, and at some point you also have a cutoff in terms of range of the hypersonic missile where you have to opt for the ICBM. But one of the advantages that the hypersonic still holds is that the hypersonic can maneuver and can also change target midway. The second advantage, or the second main advantage, is detection, and this is where we get to the real deal. By flying low, hypersonics can evade detection due to the over-the-horizon limitations of early warning radar. Of course, there are different types of radar sets and different ways of extending radar detection from the ground and in the air, but in a static example, the range at which a hypersonic is detected is far shorter than that of an ICBM. Not only that, because it flies so low, the countermeasure capabilities are artificially reduced, since the hypersonic can fly at a certain path, approaching the target within certain geographical features in mind, like for example mountains, valleys, areas with few known spotters and air defense weapons, and so on. This is a lot harder, if not impossible, to do with an ICBM, because the ICBM on a radar scope is essentially the equivalent of renting a billboard on Times Square saying, hey, here we are and we've come to nuke you. Of course, the speed of the ICBM does not mean that there is a lot of time to react, but in general, at the longer range that the detection happens and the higher the altitude is when the detection happens, the easier it is to react to the inbound bad news. This is also because of the last point, evasion. Before we go into this, it's very important to remember that even though the hypersonic missile can maneuver, it primarily relies on its speed in order to get from its launch site over to the target. Because a hypersonic missile can maneuver, it is able to steer around obstacles, known defenses or natural barriers. It also has a higher chance of defeating missiles launched against it. Not only is it likely to go faster or at equal speeds than missile launched against it, by changing altitudes and heading, what it does is energy maneuvering. Missiles only have a specific burn time, meaning that they only accelerate until their fuel runs out. After that, they continuously lose speed. Every maneuver it pulls causes it to lose substantially more energy than a straight flight. So if the incoming hypersonic changes altitude and heading, it bleeds the energy of the counter missile, drastically reducing its ability to close in, maneuver, and then get itself into a position to destroy the hypersonic. Again, it's very important to recognize that even though the hypersonic missile and the glide vehicle can maneuver, they're not going to be zigzagging across their whole flight, because at that speed that they're going at, that's going to drain their energy very, very quickly. However, even minute adjustments to the course can have a big impact on the interception. To sum this up, hypersonics are dangerous not because they go faster than ICBMs, but because they go fast enough, sometimes with additional energy reserves at very low altitudes, comparatively speaking, that then enable it to evade detection. And even if it is detected, the proximity to the target, the flight path, and the requirements to detect, identify, and then track, and then of course to hand it over this information to your air defense systems, and then you have to engage it, and then you have to wait for the missile to actually be intercepted. Well, all of this becomes an extremely difficult situation to manage in the timeframes that you actually have. So for example, a missile going at 3,700 miles per hour travels 1 mile a second. You can imagine yourself what that does to an ODA loop. And now imagine that there's not just one, but a full salvo of 10 or perhaps even 20. A couple of points on other elements such as stealth. While some hypersonics are advertised as LO or VLO, so low observable or very low observable, those are buzzwords that like to be thrown around, especially on anything that looks vaguely stealthy. It is highly questionable, given the pure price point, that extensive efforts are made to a large number of low observable hypersonics at this stage, for as long as countermeasures are limited. Now, having gone through that, there are of course countermeasure systems that are being developed to tackle this threat. So let's swing over to those. First things first, a lot of the hype surrounding these weapons revolves around the image that is being presented by various actors that these are game changers and all-powerful weapons. We've seen a lot of this until 2022 by Russia. North Korea, of course, also joined in at some point. And also, let's not forget about our own backyard. American and European actors, of course, join into this image as well. But the image that these hypersonics get, especially in the media, is exaggerated. Yes, they are dangerous, but they are no game changers, or at least no lasting game changers. This is simply a new capability on the block that requires adjustment. To break it down, think about tanks in World War I. When they first appeared by the Allies, they completely overwhelmed the German front lines. But within a year or two of their appearance, people started finding ways of defeating them. Up-calibered bolt-action rifles, lower caliber field guns employed as anti-tank guns, grenades, and so on. The same dynamic will take place here. That being said, right now there is no dedicated defensive capability against them. The United States expect to have the first systems out around about 2025, if not then sometimes in the late 2020s. The countermeasures themselves are of course diverse and can be broken down into two main categories used for detection and to intercept the countermeasures. Detection is all about detecting an incoming hypersonic as early as possible in order to identify and track it. Without detection, there is no interception. As noted earlier, the primary concern of hypersonics is their late detection, hence this focus on sea, land and air-based detection systems, which are now being complemented by looking at space. For example, the US has the Hypersonic and Ballistic Tracking Space Sensor program that works on this. The advantage of space is that with sufficient coverage, it takes away that limitation of the radar horizon and extends the detection range outwards, giving valuable time to enact a response against an incoming hypersonic. For this, you can use a space-based infrared sensor to pick up the IR signature during launch and when they deorbit or fly at high speeds. Likewise, it allows launch detection, which provides the maximum early warning. But how do you then intercept hypersonics? Various systems are being looked at right now, but most attention is currently still focused on terminal interception. Since it is still questionable if we can reliably detect hypersonics at long range, the final approach to the target is the most obvious place to start with interception systems. The margin of error in terminal interception is very small. As a general rule of thumb, a terminal counter-missile defense system requires up to 10 times the energy and maneuvering Gs of every G flown by the inbound missile in order to correct its trajectory and place itself into a position to actually destroy it. Of course, this terminal interception will eventually be complemented with countermeasures fired at further ranges. And these systems actually already exist, but they just require new calibration with more sophisticated guidance and control systems. Remember, provided you can detect a hypersonic, you've already done the main task. A hypersonic can fall victim to the same missile defense systems as a ballistic missile, provided the launch parameters are good. And this is why glide phase interceptors, in the US the CPI program works on this, are so important. They allow the hypersonic to be destroyed at further ranges, down the route it takes, and such capabilities are not that far off from conventional missile defense systems that are able to be fired from land, sea, and potentially air, and even space-based systems. While the offensive weapon in this case has a temporary advantage for now, these defensive countermeasures are of course in the works, and it is likely that eventually they will level the playing field somewhat. This is where an interesting dynamic of course appears. While hypersonics were especially pushed forward by Russia and then of course China and the US as well, from what's available to me, I think that Russia and potentially China, although it's more difficult to actually find sources there, but they might have miscalculated a bit. For the US, the resources invested into hypersonic weapons and hypersonic defense should yield a robust capability in the mid-2030s, maybe late 2030s. On the other hand, Russia and China focused massively, it appears, on the offensive in order to counter US missile systems and defense systems. And at the same time, especially Russia in this case, they appear not to really have pushed into hypersonics with themselves looking at hypersonic defense. So while their own arsenal might start to be countered by US systems, they themselves become vulnerable to hypersonics developed by the US at the same time. Now, Russia, of course, has traditionally pushed a lot of resources into air defense, so perhaps that will, of course, work in their favor. We'll have to see. But right now, from what I see, I am skeptical where this is actually going for them in terms of hypersonic defense. Let's finish this off with a big picture assessment. Hypersonics are not game changers. Currently, they are ahead of the curve in the old duel of the sword versus the shield, but that won't last forever. This is something that pretty much everyone agrees on, even in Russian and Chinese sources, despite what official media content will try to make us believe. Some experts even go as far as suggesting that hypersonics are a dead end, as their value is limited to the time in which countermeasures are still being developed, and that eventually they will fall back to the same value of conventional cruise and ballistic missiles. To be honest, I don't really buy that argument, because you can extend it to all weapon systems, and then you see that this is not necessarily a good point of view. First off, because as long as you have no countermeasures, the weapon is more potent than it could be. And that's exactly the dynamic that always forces us to develop those countermeasures. And second, weapon systems, though employed against the same targets, fulfill a very different role and complement each other. An ICBM hasn't fallen back to, say, the same value of a strategic bomber just because we found a counter to them. And also, this line of reasoning assumes that once countermeasures exist, then suddenly everyone will use them in the same way and at the same rate and at the same capabilities, and that is exceptionally unlikely. It is here that an interesting dynamic appears, and that's how these hypersonics add options. For example, the most scary part is, of course, when these are mounted in a sub. You put them off the coast of another country, launch and hit your targets within minutes, completely circumventing the defensive kill chain that first of all needs to detect the weapon, then make a decision on what to do, and then execute their actions. So where are hypersonics going then? Well, either we see them going the way of the dodo as they become a developmental dead end, once of course more sophisticated sort of counters emerge, or alternatively attempts to regulate the development and the use of these weapons through new international agreements may emerge. However, hypersonics do provide advantages that may make them worthwhile enough to keep developing them, unless countries voluntarily choose not to. Thus, we might in fact see a turn towards both a tactical and a strategic use. First, there may be a contraction to smaller, short-range hypersonic cruise missile systems used at the regional level. By pushing that threat bubble outwards, these may well be used to augment the typical cruise missile threat and endanger key targets. So industrial targets, carrier groups, early warning radar, command and control, anything that is a key link in the defensive capabilities or operational capabilities of the opposing force. In short, it is an augmented cruise missile used in much the same way. And we have seen in Ukraine how difficult the defense against normal cruise missiles is, even though it is certainly possible. It is likely that certain high-value targets like carriers will also benefit from more terminal defense, potentially reducing the threat, though only insofar as that they may reduce the risk when pushing into those threat bubbles, not by completely eliminating that threat. Hypersonics are as much of an active as they are a passive level threat. In parallel, we may see a gradual development of glide vehicles away from atmospheric use and go more towards what the Chinese have done with their orbiting hypersonic glide vehicles for what is called fractional orbital bombardment systems, or FOBs, where the weapon remains in orbit until it is in a position to strike, and as such extending the range considerably. Compared to an ICBM, this still reduces early warning time from conventional radar and may complement intercontinental ballistic capabilities. However, it's very early days on those dynamics, and we'll also have to see what actually happens on the political level with potential treaties restricting the use and the development of weapons that are used in the so-called space domain. There are also various technical limitations to hypersonics that we shouldn't forget. Going at the speed that they go at requires various technical solutions to the missile's structural integrity and its thermal resistance, especially in the lower and frontal portions of the weapon. And its inertial guidance, of course, is important as well, as ionization around the system will prevent reliable external guidance, which is why most of them are developed to fly between Mach 5 to Mach 10. Also, in case of hypersonic missiles, the scramjet propulsion will have to be optimized to fly at set altitudes, thus leading to a loss of efficiency once forced to operate outside of that bandwidth it was developed for. The fact that the speeds also complicate the installation of front-mounted sensors due to structural constraints and thermal constraints also limits the missile's ability versus maneuvering targets like, for example, ships. Big thank you here to patrons and channel members. If you enjoy this sort of content, do check out the description as well for some support options, either via Patreon. Channel members, you get early access to videos, and we also have a Discord server as well as bi-monthly get-togethers there where we talk about all these subjects. Also a big thank you here to Andrew, and as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.